I've never told this story before. Not to my family, not to the lawyers, not even to the priest who came to our cell every Sunday with his worn leather Bible and tired eyes. But today, something changed. Maybe it's because I'm finally free. Maybe it's because I can't carry this weight anymore. They call it survival. I call it something else entirely. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what I found in the darkest place on earth. What matters is the single page that changed everything. A page that shouldn't have existed. A page that saved my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. Let me take you inside. Not to the Brazil you see on postcards, but to the Brazil they hide behind concrete walls and razor wire, where men disappear and only their ghosts come back to haunt their families. Before I tell you what I found, I need to show you what I lost. If you've ever wondered how hope survives in the most hopeless places, stay with me, because what happened next will change how you think about faith, betrayal, and the thin line between salvation and damnation. Hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning of a story that almost died with me in that cell. It started with a mistake. That's how most prison stories begin, isn't it? But this wasn't my mistake. This was someone else's mistake that became my nightmare. The year was 2018. I was 26, working construction in Sao Paulo, sending money back to my mother in Bahia. Clean record, a clean life. I'd never even seen the inside of a police station. Then came the raid. They burst through my apartment door at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday. Black uniforms, automatic weapons, shouting words I couldn't understand through the chaos. They said they were looking for drugs. They said they had information. They said a lot of things that turned out to be lies. What they found was nothing. What they planted was everything. 2 kilos of cocaine in my bedroom drawer. A drawer I'd opened every morning for 3 years to pull out clean work clothes. A drawer that had never held anything more dangerous than aspirin. This isn't mine, I kept saying over and over. Like a prayer that no one was listening to, the detective who cuffed me had tired eyes and coffee stains on his shirt. He looked at me like he'd seen this scene 1,000 times before, like he was already writing the report in his head. They all say that, he whispered as he pushed me into the patrol car. Every single one. The trial was a joke without a punchline. Public defender who'd never seen my case file before walking into the courtroom. Judge who kept checking his watch. Prosecutor who spoke about me like I wasn't even there. They had their evidence. They had their witnesses. What they didn't have was the truth. But truth doesn't matter when you're poor in Brazil. Truth doesn't matter when you're young and black and from the wrong neighborhood. Truth is a luxury I couldn't afford. 15 years. That's what the judge gave me. 15 years for something I didn't do, for something I'd never even seen until they pulled it out of my drawer and held it up like a trophy. The gavel came down like thunder. My mother's scream echoed through the courtroom like a wounded animal. The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists like the final punctuation mark on a sentence I'd never written. That was the last day of my old life. Everything after belonged to the system, but what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the real sentence hadn't been handed down yet. The real punishment was waiting for me behind bars. Where judges wore prison uniforms and justice came at the end of a sharpened spoon, they processed me at Penitenciaria do Estado on a Thursday. Strip search, delousing shower, grey uniform that smelled like industrial disinfectant and other men's. Fear. I was assigned to Pavilion C, Block 7, Cell 23 home. My cellmate was a man named João, who'd been inside for 8 years. Robbery gone wrong, he said. Man died. Life sentence. He had kind eyes and scarred hands and a way of speaking that made you forget where you were for just a moment. First rule, he told me as we lay in our bunks that first night. Never let them see you pray. They'll think you're weak. They'll think you have something to hope for. Hope makes you a target. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a place where men needed God more than air, faith had become dangerous. Prayer had become weakness. Hope had become a liability. I promised myself I wouldn't pray. I promised myself I wouldn't hope. I promised myself I wouldn't break. Some promises are easier to keep than others. The first month passed like a fever dream. Days blended into nights, meals that tasted like punishment, showers that felt like standing under acid rain, sleep that never quite came, because silence in prison isn't peaceful, it's terrifying. During the day, we had work assignments. I was put on laundry duty, 8 hours of industrial washing machines and chemical burns on my hands. The supervisor was a lifer named Carlos, who spoke in whispers and kept a knife hidden in his boot. He was fair, which in prison meant he only threatened to kill you when you deserved it. "You're different," he said to me one afternoon as we folded sheets that would never really be clean. "Most guys, they come in swinging or crying. You came in quiet. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know quiet was a choice." "Quiet's good," he continued, not looking at me. "Quiet keeps you alive, but quiet won't keep you sane. You need something else for that." What he didn't tell me was that some of us never find that something else. The first time I saw the Bible, it was being used as a weapon. A fight had broken out in the yard. Something about a gambling debt, something about disrespect. In prison, everything is about disrespect. Two men rolling in the dirt, throwing punches that sounded like meat hitting concrete. The guards watched from their tower with binoculars, and boredom. When it was over, one man was unconscious. The other was holding a thick black book, blood spattered across its worn cover. He'd used it like a club, bringing it down on the other man's skull with the force of righteousness. "Get this trash out of here," he said, tossing the Bible into the dirt like garbage. No one picked it up. In prison, other people's blood is a curse you don't want to inherit. The book lay there for hours, pages fluttering in the wind like wounded birds. By evening it had disappeared, taken by the cleanup crew or blown away by the wind. I never thought about that Bible again. Not until much later. Not until I needed it more than my next breath. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand what happened to change me from a man who wouldn't pray to a man who couldn't stop praying. What I'm about to tell you next is the reason this story almost never got told. It's the reason I spent 3 years in solitary confinement. It's the reason some people in that prison wanted me dead. But it's also the reason I'm alive today to tell you this story. Don't go anywhere, because the real confession is just beginning. 3 months into my sentence, I received my first visitor. Not my mother, she couldn't afford the bus fare from Bahia. Not my friends, they'd all disappeared the moment my name appeared in the newspaper. My visitor was someone I'd never seen before. Her name was Anna, and she said she was from a legal aid organization. Mid-30s, professional clothes that looked out of place in the visiting room, and an intensity in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. She said she'd heard about my case. She said she believed I was innocent. She said she wanted to help. I should have been suspicious. I should have asked more questions. I should have remembered that in prison, help always comes with a price. "I need you to do something for me," she said during our second visit. Her voice was lower now, more careful. "There's a man in your block. They call him Pastor. I need you to get close to him." Pastor wasn't his real name. Nobody used real names in there. He was in his 50s, serving life for armed robbery, but he'd found God somewhere along the way, or God had found him. He ran the religious services in our pavilion, led prayer groups, and somehow managed to maintain a peace in a place designed for violence. "What do you want me to find out?" I asked. Anna leaned forward. "Pastor has connections outside. Letters get smuggled in and out through his network. We think he's helping. Organize something big, something that could get a lot of innocent people hurt." The way she said innocent people made my skin crawl. In prison, you learn to recognize when someone is lying to you. but I was young and desperate and stupid. I thought helping her might help me. I thought cooperation might lead to reduced sentence. I thought wrong about a lot of things. Getting close to Pastor was easier than I expected. He welcomed anyone who showed interest in the faith. Tuesday and Thursday evening services in the common area. Bible study on Sunday afternoons. Prayer circles whenever someone needed comfort. "You have the look," Pastor said to me after my first service. The look of someone carrying weight that isn't his to carry. He wasn't wrong, but the weight I was carrying wasn't guilt, it was betrayal. I was there to spy on the one man in that place who offered genuine kindness. I never was much for religion, I told him. "God doesn't care what you were," Pastor replied. "He cares what you choose to become." The services were simple. Hymns sung in voices rough from years of shouting and smoking. Prayers whispered like secrets. Stories from the Bible that somehow felt relevant to men locked in cages. Pastor had a way of making those ancient words feel current, urgent, necessary, but I was looking for something else. I was looking for the letters Anna had mentioned. The network. The evidence that this man who spoke of forgiveness was actually planning something dark. Week after week, I attended services. I listened to prayers. I watched Pastor with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. And week after week, I found nothing suspicious, nothing criminal, nothing that would justify what I was doing. All I found was a man who genuinely believed that hope could survive in a hopeless place. It took 6 weeks before I found the letters. Pastor kept them in a hollowed-out Bible, not the one from the services. That one was real, worn thin from use. This was a different book, one he kept hidden under his mattress. The pages had been carefully cut out to create a small compartment. Inside were folded pieces of paper, some yellow with age, others fresh and white. I found it during yard time when Pastor was in the shower. My hands shook as I opened it. My heart pounded as I unfolded the first letter. This was it. This was the evidence Anna needed. This was my ticket to a reduced sentence. The first letter was from a woman named Maria, Pastor's wife. She wrote about their daughter's graduation from nursing school, about the grandchildren he'd never met, about how proud she was that he'd found purpose even behind bars, how his letters kept her faith alive during the darkest moments. The second letter was from someone called Miguel, a former inmate who'd gotten out 2 years earlier. He wrote about the job Pastor had helped him find through contacts on the outside, about the family he'd reconnected with, about the man he'd become because Pastor had refused to let him give up, letter after letter. All of them the same. All of them about hope, about second chances, about a man using whatever influence he had to help people build better lives. There was no criminal conspiracy, no dangerous network, no evidence of anything except one man's quiet campaign to prove that redemption was possible even in hell. I put the letters back exactly as I'd found them. I closed the Bible. I returned it to its hiding place under the mattress, and I walked to the bathroom to throw up everything I'd eaten that day. I'd been looking for evidence of a crime. Instead, I'd found evidence of grace. That night, I couldn't sleep. Joan sensed something was wrong but didn't push. In prison, you learn to give people space for their demons. We all had plenty to go around. I kept thinking about the letters, about Pastor's wife waiting for him on the outside, about the former inmates who'd found new lives because one man had refused to let them believe they were beyond saving, about how I was planning to destroy all of it for a woman I barely knew and a promise that probably wasn't real. The next morning at breakfast, Pastor sat beside me. He did that sometimes, appeared next to people who looked like they needed company. "You seem troubled, brother," he said. I almost choked on my coffee. "I'm fine." Fine is what we tell people when we don't want to tell them the truth. Pastor said, but fine won't help you carry whatever weight you're carrying. I wanted to confess right then. I wanted to tell him about Anna and the spy mission and how I'd violated his trust. I wanted to ask for his forgiveness and his guidance and his protection from the storm I'd created. Instead, I said nothing. I finished my breakfast in silence and went to work in the laundry, where the noise of the machines drowned out the voice in my head, telling me I'd become something I didn't recognize. Sometimes the worst betrayals are the ones we commit against people who never deserved them. Anna came for her monthly visit right on schedule. This time, she brought a tape recorder and a legal pad filled with questions. She was excited. She could sense I had something for her. "What did you find?" she asked before I'd even sat down. I looked at her across that metal table in the visiting room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, guards watching from the corners. Families at other tables, sharing brief moments of connection across the divide between freedom and captivity. "Nothing," I said. Anna's expression hardened. "What do you mean, nothing?" "I mean, there's nothing there. No criminal network, no dangerous plans. Just a man trying to help people. That's impossible. We have reliable intelligence that... Your reliable intelligence is wrong." Anna leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Listen to me carefully. We know Pastor is involved in something. We know he has connections to activities that could undermine security. If you don't help us get the evidence we need, I can't help you with your appeal." There it was. The threat disguised as concern. The promise revealed as manipulation. I'd been nothing more than a tool to her from the beginning. "Then I guess you can't help me," I said. I stood up and walked away. I never saw Anna again, but I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. I should have realized that people like her don't give up easily. I should have understood that my refusal to betray Pastor had painted a target on my back. 2 weeks later, the real punishment began. The first sign something was wrong came during morning count. Instead of my usual work assignment, I was told to report to the administrative office. The guard who escorted me didn't make eye contact. His hand stayed on his baton the entire walk. In the office sat a man I'd never seen before. Expensive suit, shiny shoes, the kind of soft hands that had never done manual labor. He introduced himself as Detective Silva from the State Police Intelligence Unit. "We understand you've been uncooperative with our investigation," he said without preamble. "I don't know what you're talking about. Pastor has been running an illegal communication network, smuggling information in and out of the prison, information that threatens state security. We need your help to stop it." The same lies Anna had told me, but with official authority behind them. "I've never seen any evidence of that," I said. Detective Silva smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Evidence can be found anywhere if you know where to look. Evidence can also be created if it doesn't exist. Your choice is simple. Help us build our case against Pastor, or face the consequences of being his accomplice." I felt the walls closing in. "I'm not his accomplice in anything. That's not how it will look in your file. That's not how it will look to a judge when your case comes up for appeal. That's not how it will look to the other inmates when word spreads that you've been protecting a snitch." The threat was clear. Help them frame Pastor or be framed myself. Betray an innocent man or face whatever consequences they chose to deliver. I made my choice. "Go to hell," I said. Detective Silva's smile got wider. "Wrong answer." They transferred me to solitary that evening. No explanation given to the other inmates. No chance to say goodbye to João or Pastor or anyone else. Just a sudden removal from everything I'd come to know as normal. Solitary confinement is a particular kind of hell. A concrete box barely large enough to lie down in, a metal toilet, a thin mattress, a slot in the door for food trays and whatever torture the guards felt like delivering. No books, no radio, no human contact except for the guards who brought meals and seemed to take pleasure in slamming the food slot as loudly as possible. 23 hours a day in that box. 1 hour in a slightly larger box they called the exercise yard. No grass, no sky, just concrete walls and the constant sound of men losing their minds in similar boxes all around me. They told me it was temporary. They told me it was for my own protection. They told me a lot of lies during those first few weeks. The truth was simpler. They were breaking me down, trying to drive me crazy enough to give them what they wanted, trying to make me so desperate for human contact that I'd agree to anything to get out of that box. What they didn't count on was finding the Bible page. I'd been in solitary for 2 months when I found it. 2 months of talking to walls and counting concrete blocks and slowly forgetting what other human voices sounded like. 2 months of questioning every decision I'd made since Anna first walked into that visiting room. The page was tucked between my mattress and the metal bed frame. Just a single sheet of thin paper, yellowed with age, torn along one edge like it had been ripped from a book in haste or anger. At first, I thought it was garbage. Paper left behind by the previous occupant of my cell, maybe a letter or a court document. In solitary, you learn to examine everything for hidden meaning, for any connection to the world beyond your concrete box. But when I unfolded it, I saw text. Not handwriting, but printed words in small, clear type. Portuguese, but the formal kind used in official documents or old books. At the top of the page, barely visible, were the numbers Psalm 23. I'd heard of Psalm 23. Even people who'd never set foot in a church knew about the valley of death and the shepherd and the rod and staff. But I'd never actually read it. Never held those words in my hands when I needed them most desperately. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. That was an interesting word choice. I wanted everything in that moment. I wanted freedom. I wanted justice. I wanted my old life back. I wanted to stop feeling like I was drowning in other people's decisions. I shall not want. Not, I will have everything I desire, but I will not be defined by my desires. Not, I will get what I deserve, but I will not be consumed by what I lack. It was a subtle distinction, but in solitary confinement, subtle distinctions become life-changing revelations. I read that page every day, multiple times a day, when the lights went out at night and I couldn't sleep, because silence in solitary isn't peaceful, it's deafening. When they brought breakfast and I couldn't eat because the food tasted like despair. When the hour for exercise came and I couldn't move because depression had settled into my bones like concrete. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Green pastures and still waters. In my concrete box, those words became a form of time travel. I could close my eyes and see the fields around my grandmother's house in Bahia. I could hear the stream that ran behind the property where I'd played as a child. I could smell the grass after rain and feel the sun on my face and remember what it was like to be human. The words were performing magic on my mind, taking me somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere possible. He restoreth my soul. My soul needed restoring. I'd lost pieces of it the day they arrested me for a crime I didn't commit. I'd lost more pieces during the trial when I realized the system didn't care about truth. I'd lost even more when I agreed to spy on Pastor, when I let desperation turn me into someone I didn't recognize. But somehow, in that cell, reading those words over and over, I started to feel like maybe restoration was possible. Maybe souls could be rebuilt, even after they'd been shattered. Maybe hope wasn't a luxury I couldn't afford. Maybe hope was the only thing I could afford. The more I read that page, the more questions I had about how it had gotten there. Bibles weren't allowed in solitary. Books of any kind were contraband. The guards searched our cells regularly, looking for anything that might make life more bearable. How had a single page from a Bible survived their searches? How long had it been hidden in that mattress? Who had put it there and why? During my single hour of exercise, I started paying attention to the other cells, listening for voices. watching for signs of who might have been there before me. Most of the men in solitary had been there for months, some for years. They'd developed their own forms of communication, tapping codes on the walls, shouting messages through the ventilation systems, passing notes through gaps in the cell doors. One afternoon, I heard a voice coming through the wall from the cell next to mine. "You find something good in there?" I pressed my ear to the concrete. "What do you mean?" "The page. Every man who comes through that cell finds the page. It's been making rounds for about 2 years now." My heart stopped. "You know about the page?" "I left it there. Just like the guy before me left it for me. Just like you'll leave it for the next guy." The voice belonged to someone called Marcus. He'd been in solitary for 8 months for fighting with guards. Before that, he'd spent 3 years in general population where he'd known Pastor. "Pastor's the one who started it," Marcus told me through the wall. "Back when they first put him in solitary for a month, some nonsense charge about smuggling contraband. He tore that page from his Bible before they confiscated it, hidden it in the mattress, said it was for whoever needed it most." I felt tears on my cheeks. "They transferred me here because I wouldn't help them build a case against him." "Yeah, that sounds like Pastor. Man never met a fight he wouldn't take if it meant protecting someone else." Is he okay?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, sadder. "They killed him last week." The world stopped. Everything stopped. The concrete walls, the fluorescent lights, the distant sounds of guards and inmates, and the machinery of incarceration. Everything went silent except for the sound of my heart breaking. "What happened?" I whispered. "Officially, natural causes, heart attack during morning exercise. But Pastor was 55 years old and healthy as a horse. And word is, they found bruises on his body that didn't match the story." I pressed my face against the cold wall, trying to get closer to Marcus's voice, trying to make sense of something that would never make sense. "They murdered him?" "Can't prove it. But Pastor had been asking questions about why you disappeared, been making noise about inmates being transferred to solitary without proper documentation, been demanding to speak with higher-ups about conditions down here. Pastor had died trying to protect me. A man I'd been sent to spy on had died fighting for my rights. There's something else," Marcus continued. "Before they killed him, Pastor got word to some of us, said to tell you that he knew. He knew about the spy assignment from the beginning. He knew why you were really coming to his services." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. "He knew?" "He also said to tell you that it didn't matter. Said he could see your heart, and your heart was good. Said you chose to protect him, even when it cost you everything. Said that's the definition of grace." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the magnitude of what I'd learned. Pastor had known I was a spy and had loved me anyway, had protected me even when I was supposed to be betraying him, had died trying to make sure I was treated justly in a system designed to destroy justice. And he'd left me a page from his Bible, a gift, a lifeline, a final message that hope could survive even in the darkest places. That night I read Psalm 23 with different eyes. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." The valley of the shadow of death wasn't just a metaphor anymore. It was the place where I lived, where all of us lived, where Pastor had lived until they killed him for refusing to abandon his principles. But the psalm didn't promise that we wouldn't walk through that valley. It promised that we wouldn't walk through it alone. "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." My enemies were all around me. The corrupt detectives who'd framed me, the prosecutors who'd railroaded me, the guards who'd beaten Pastor to death. The system that had turned justice into a weapon against the poor and powerless. But somewhere in the midst of all that evil, grace had prepared a table. A single page from a Bible. A message of hope passed from hand to hand through the worst place in Brazil, a community of broken men looking out for each other when no one else would. My cup runneth over. In solitary confinement, with nothing but concrete walls and a metal toilet, my cup was overflowing, not with material blessings, but with something more precious, with the knowledge that I wasn't alone, with the certainty that goodness could survive in the face of overwhelming evil, with the promise that this wasn't the end of my story. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Forever is a long time when you're serving 15 years for a crime you didn't commit. Forever is an impossible concept when you're locked in a box for 23 hours a day. Forever is a promise that doesn't make sense in a world where good men get murdered for asking inconvenient questions. But Pastor had believed in forever, had lived like forever was real, had died protecting the idea that forever was worth fighting. For maybe it was time for me to believe it too. The Bible page is still with me today. 11 years later, after everything that happened next, after appeals and transfers and finally, miraculously, exoneration, it sits framed on my wall as a reminder that hope can survive anywhere, that grace can flourish in the darkest soil, that love is stronger than the systems designed to destroy it. But there's one more thing I need to tell you about that page. One more discovery that changes everything about this story. I spent another year in solitary confinement. 12 more months of concrete walls and fluorescent lights, and the slow erosion of everything that had once defined me as human. But I had the page, and the page had become more than paper and ink. It had become a daily practice, a form of meditation, a conversation with something larger than myself. Every morning, I would read those words and remember Pastor's face during services. Every afternoon, I would recite them from memory and feel connected to Marcus in the next cell and all the other men who'd found comfort in the same verses. Every evening, I would fold the page carefully and tuck it back into its hiding place, knowing that someday I would pass it on to whoever needed it next. But late one night, during one of my countless readings, I noticed something I'd never seen before. In the margin of the page, barely visible in the dim light from the hallway, someone had written something in pencil. The handwriting was small and careful, squeezed into the narrow space beside the printed text. At first, I thought it was just random marks, scratches or stains that had accumulated over time. But when I held the page at just the right angle, the words became clear. For Marcus, the shepherd knows your name. P. My hands started shaking. This wasn't just any page from any Bible. This was a page that Pastor had personally selected and marked for Marcus. A specific gift for a specific person in a specific moment of need. But there was more. Along the bottom edge of the page, in even smaller writing, were additional notes. For Joan, still waters run deep. Keep swimming, P. For Carlos, green pastures await. Don't give up. P. For Miguel, your rod and staff are your courage and faith. Use them. P. Pastor hadn't just torn a random page from his Bible when they put him in solitary. He'd chosen Psalm 23 specifically, and he'd personalized it for every man he thought might need it. He'd turned a single page into a network of hope, a system of support that could survive even after his death. But there was one more note at the very bottom, squeezed into the corner in handwriting so small I could barely make it out. For the young man who chose truth over freedom, you are not forgotten. He'd written that note for me before we'd ever met, before I'd been assigned to spy on him. Before any of this had happened, Pastor had somehow known that someday a young man would face a choice between betraying his principles and accepting the consequences of integrity. He'd known that young man would need to be reminded that God sees the choices we make in the dark, He'd known that sometimes the greatest victories look like defeats to everyone, except the people who matter most. The page changed everything about my time in prison. Not just the solitary months, but everything that came after. When they finally released me back to general population, I carried those words with me like armor. When other inmates tried to recruit me into their gangs or their schemes, I remembered the table prepared in the presence of enemies. When the appeals court rejected my case for the third time, I remembered that my cup could overflow even in the valley of the shadow of death. I started my own Bible study group, not because I'd become some kind of saint, but because I'd learned that hope shared is hope multiplied. Men would come to our meetings carrying their own valleys, their own shadows, their own questions about whether goodness could survive in a place designed to destroy it. We'd sit in that common area where Pastor used to lead services, and I'd tell them about the page, about the notes in the margins, about a man who'd loved his enemies so completely that he'd planned for their spiritual needs even after they killed him. Some of those men are still inside. Some got out and built new lives. A few came back on new charges, but they came back different. They came back carrying something that couldn't be taken away by judges or prosecutors or corrupt cops. They came back carrying hope. On my final day in prison, after serving 11 years of a 15-year sentence that should never have been imposed, I went to the solitary unit one last time. They'd moved Marcus to another facility years earlier, but I'd heard through the prison network that a new man had been placed in my old cell. His name was David, 22 years old. Drug charge that had been inflated into trafficking. Family that couldn't afford a real lawyer. The same story that had repeated thousands of times in courtrooms across Brazil. I found him during visiting hours, when the guards were distracted and the corridors were full of families and lawyers and advocates. I knocked on the metal door of cell 23 and waited for a response. Who's there? Someone who's been where you are. Someone who has something that belongs to you. I slid the folded page through the gap at the bottom of the door. I heard him pick it up, unfold it, and go quiet. "Is this real?" he whispered. "As real as anything gets in here." "How do you know I need this?" I thought about that question. About Pastor's prophetic gift for seeing what people needed before they knew they needed it. About the ways grace operates in systems designed to prevent grace from operating. "Because we all need it," I said finally. "And because someone who loved us both left it for us to find." I walked away from that door knowing I'd never see David again, but I also walked away knowing that the page would continue its journey, that somewhere in the margins there might be space for one more note in Pastor's careful handwriting. One more promise that goodness and mercy would follow us all the days of our lives. Today I work with a legal organization that fights wrongful convictions. We've helped exonerate 43 people in the past 5 years, 43 lives restored. To families that had given up hope. 43 pieces of evidence that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. But more important than the legal work is the other work. The visits to men still inside. The letters to families still waiting. The Bible studies in community. Centers and churches and wherever people gather to remember that we are more than the worst things we've done. I still read Psalm 23 every morning. I still feel Pastor's presence when I speak those words. I still believe that somewhere in Brazil's prisons, that page is making its rounds, being discovered by men who need to know they're not forgotten, being passed along by hands that understand the power of small acts of love. The Bible page that survived Brazil's prisons wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a testament to the idea that hope can be folded small enough to hide from any system, carried light enough to pass between any hands, and powerful enough to transform lives that the world had written off as lost causes. There's something I haven't told you yet, something I discovered only 3 years ago, long after I thought this story was finished. It changes everything about what that page meant. and it proves that some miracles are too large to understand until enough time has passed to see their full scope. I was giving a presentation at a conference about prison reform when a woman approached me afterward. She was in her 70s, well-dressed, with the kind of gentle authority that comes from decades of quiet service. She waited until the crowd had dispersed before introducing herself. "My name is Maria," she said. "I believe you. Knew my husband." The world tilted. I'd heard that name countless times in the letters I'd found in Pastor's hidden Bible. His wife, the woman who'd waited for him, supported him, never stopped believing in the man he'd become behind bars. "Pastor," I whispered. She nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "He wrote to me about you, about the young man who'd been sent to spy on him but chose to protect him instead, about how proud he was that you'd found your faith in that terrible place." We sat in the hotel lobby for 3 hours that night. Maria told me stories about her husband that I'd never heard, about his childhood in poverty, his early crimes, the moment in prison when he'd decided to become someone different, about the letters he'd written to former inmates, the money he'd somehow arranged to send to their families, the network of hope he'd built one relationship at a time. "He never told me about the Bible page," she said eventually, "but that sounds exactly like something he would do." Then she opened her purse and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "He left this for you," she said, "with instructions that I should find you someday and give it to you. He said you'd understand what it meant." Inside the tissue paper was another Bible, not the hollowed-out one I'd seen in his cell, but a real one, old and worn, with pages marked by decades of reading. On the inside cover, in Pastor's careful handwriting, was an inscription, "For my young brother in Christ." The page was just the beginning. "The whole story is waiting for you." "Pastor," I opened that Bible to Psalm 23, expecting to find the source of the page that had changed my life. Instead, I found something impossible. The page was there, complete, uncut, still attached to the binding. I flipped through the entire book, looking for signs that any pages had been torn out. I examined the binding, checked for loose threads or adhesive marks. Nothing. The Bible was intact. "That's impossible," I said to Maria. "The page in solitary came from somewhere." Maria smiled in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment for years. "My husband never tore a page from his Bible," she said. "He wouldn't do that. The Bible was too sacred to him." "Then where did the page come from?" "That's what he wanted you to figure out." I spent the next 6 months investigating. I contacted Marcus, who'd been released and was working as a mechanic in Rio. I tracked down David, the young man who'd received the page on my final day. I reached out to former inmates, prison officials, anyone who might have information about the mysterious page that had been circulating through solitary confinement. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about faith, about miracles, about the ways God works in the darkest places. The page hadn't come from Pastor's Bible. It hadn't come from any Bible in the prison. According to the records I was able to access, no Bibles had been confiscated from solitary confinement during the time period when the page first appeared. But more than that, the page itself was wrong. Not theologically wrong, but physically wrong. The typeface was different from any Portuguese Bible in circulation. The paper was a weight and texture that hadn't been used in religious publications for decades. The translation was from a version that hadn't been printed since the 1960s. An expert in biblical manuscripts examined the page and gave me a report that made no rational sense. Based on the paper composition and printing techniques, he estimated that the page had been produced sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s. But based on the wear patterns and aging, it appeared to be much older, as if it had been exposed to conditions that aged it artificially. This is very unusual, he told me. It's almost as if someone took a page from a 60-year-old Bible and then subjected it to additional aging through some kind of accelerated process. But the most unusual discovery was what he found when he examined the margins under magnification. The notes attributed to Pastor, the personal messages to Marcus, João, Carlos, Miguel and me, had been written at different times with different pencils. The handwriting was consistent, but the graphite composition varied, suggesting that each note had been added months or years apart. Somehow, Pastor had been adding notes to this page for years before any of us had ever met him. I returned to the prison one last time to interview the guards who'd worked solitary confinement during my time there. Most of them had retired or transferred, but I found one man willing to talk. His name was Santos, and he'd worked the unit for 15 years before taking early retirement. He remembered Pastor, remembered me, remembered the strange things that had happened during those years. That cell was cursed, he said over coffee in a diner near the prison. Cell 23. Weird things always happened there. What kind of weird things? Inmates would find things that shouldn't exist, letters that had never been delivered, photos of family members they'd never shared with anyone. And yeah, religious materials, pages from books, prayer cards, things like that. Santos lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The official explanation was that previous inmates were hiding contraband. But I searched that cell top to bottom every time someone new moved in. There was never anything there when they arrived, but somehow they'd always find something they needed. Did you ever report this? Report what? That God was smuggling hope into solitary confinement? Santos laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. The warden would have transferred me to a mental health facility. He took a long drag from his cigarette. But I'll tell you something. In 15 years of working that unit, I never saw an inmate leave cell 23 the same way they entered it. Something about that place changed people, made them stronger or at least more peaceful. Do you think Pastor had something to do with it? Santos was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, more careful. Pastor was a special man, but what happened in that cell was bigger than any one person. It was like, he struggled to find the words, like the whole universe was conspiring to make sure nobody suffered alone. I never found a rational explanation. For the Bible page, I never discovered where it came from, or how it appeared in that cell, or why it contained notes written in Pastor's handwriting years before the events they referenced. But I did find something else, something that mattered more than explanations over. The years since my release, I've received letters from men who'd been in cell 23, dozens of them, each describing the same experience, finding something they needed exactly when they needed it most. A Bible verse, a prayer, a letter from home, a photograph, a simple note saying, "You are not forgotten." And in each case, they'd found not just the physical item, but the spiritual strength to pass it on to someone else who needed it more. The page I'd found wasn't unique. It was part of something larger, a network of grace operating inside Brazil's prison system, a conspiracy of hope that somehow managed to survive and flourish despite every effort to destroy it. Maybe Pastor had started it. Maybe it had started itself. Maybe it had always existed, waiting for people desperate enough to believe in miracles. What I know for certain is that it continues. Right now, somewhere in Brazil, a man in solitary confinement is finding something that shouldn't exist, something that will remind him that he's not alone, something that will give him the strength to survive one more day, one more week, one more year of hell, and when his time comes to leave that cell, he'll pass that gift on to whoever comes next. Because that's what hope does. It multiplies when it's shared. It grows stronger when it's tested. It survives everything that tries to kill it. 3 months ago, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single page torn from a Bible, Psalm 23 in Portuguese, with notes in the margins written in familiar handwriting. But this time there was something new. At the bottom of the page, in fresh pencil marks, someone had written, "For the lawyer who remembers what prison feels like, the shepherd is still watching over his flock. Keep fighting for us." A grateful brother. I don't know who sent it. I don't know how they got my address. I don't know why that page chose to find me again after all these years, but I know what it means. It means the story isn't over. It means somewhere in Brazil's prisons, men are still finding hope in impossible places. It means Pastor's legacy continues to multiply, one page at a time, one life at a time, one miracle at a time. It means that no system built by human hands can ultimately contain what the human spirit is capable of when it refuses to surrender. Tonight, as I finish telling you this story, that page sits on my desk beside my computer. 11 years of age have made it even more fragile, but the words are still clear. The promises are still true. The hope is still alive. Tomorrow morning, I'll read those words again. I'll remember Pastor and Marcus and David and all the other men whose lives intersected with mine in that concrete hell. I'll think about the woman named Anna who tried to use me as a weapon against innocence, and I'll forgive her because forgiveness is the only thing that breaks cycles of harm. And then I'll go back to work, back to the courtrooms and law libraries, and prison visiting rooms where justice delayed is slowly becoming justice served, back to the fight for men and women still trapped in systems designed to punish poverty rather than prevent crime. Because that's what the Bible page taught me. That hope isn't something you find once and keep forever. It's something you practice daily, something you pass along whenever you get the chance, something you trust will continue its journey long after you're gone. The Bible page that survived. Brazil's prisons wasn't just mine. It wasn't just Pastor's. It belongs to everyone who's ever felt forgotten, abandoned, written off as beyond saving. It belongs to everyone who's ever needed to be reminded that grace can reach into the darkest places and bring light. And maybe, if you've stayed with me this long, if you've listened to this confession from beginning to end, maybe it belongs to you too. Maybe you're the next person who needs to know that you're not alone, that your cup can overflow even in the valley of the shadow of death, that goodness and mercy really will follow you all the days of your life. Maybe you're the next guardian of hope in a world that seems determined to kill it. The page is still out there, making its rounds, still carrying messages of love from people who understood that small acts of kindness can change everything. Still proving that systems built on punishment and despair can never finally triumph over the human capacity for grace. All you have to do is be ready to receive it when it finds you. All you have to do is believe that miracles come disguised as ordinary paper, folded small enough to hide in the darkest places, powerful enough to transform lives that everyone else has given up on. All you have to do is trust that somewhere, someone is praying for your deliverance. Someone is writing notes in the margins of hope. Someone is making sure you won't be forgotten. The shepherd knows your name, and the page is still traveling.